Hi everybody. Is this live? Yep. Okay. I think this is going. I hope you can see me. I hope you can hear me. I'm Jess Sherman. This is my, I did a live stream last week on diet and behavior. This is the second one because that one was so much fun. I got lots of interaction and lots of questions, which I love. So if you have questions, please type them in there. I will see them. Let me just give Facebook a moment to let you know that I'm doing this. The live stream that I did last week was on 4 reasons why food matters to behavior. Mostly I'm talking about kids because that's sort of who I work most with. I work with parents who are interested in figuring out whether food is having an impact on their child's behavior, be it learning, attention, a diagnosis or not, autism, autistic-like behaviors, opposition, tantrums, meltdowns, lack of sleep, not being able to sleep or fall asleep, anxiety, depression, mood and behavior stuff mostly. And I try to help them figure out whether there's a food piece. And I mentioned last week that there's always a food piece as part of the puzzle. Your child really is a puzzle. And it can be hard to find all of the pieces to that puzzle. But food does play a role. And in the live stream last time, I talked about 4 different ways why food plays a role and 3 misconceptions about diet and tweaking diet, which kind of lead people down this path of kind of dismissing it as not a viable thing to look to. And it's really a shame because it's a very, very powerful tool. And I see a lot of people spending a lot of money in a lot of places and missing the diet piece. And it really is a valuable tool that's at your fingertips. So I try to teach parents kind of how to simplify thinking about it because it can be kind of confusing. But I try to give you a roadmap basically to figure out the food and feeding piece. So that was last time. It's still in my Facebook feed, so scroll through and you can see that there. Today, what I want to talk about is gluten and casein. Because when people are told to tinker with food, taking out gluten is usually the first thing that they're taught, that is suggested to them. And not following far behind is taking out dairy. So then that leaves parents in like this quandary of like, oh, is there actually anything to this? Is it all anecdotal? Is there any research? Is this worth all the effort? Is it dangerous? Am I going to start to induce nutritional deficiencies and such? All of super valid, and that's what I want to address here because very, very, very common for me to get those questions. I know a lot of people are going to watch this on the replay, and that's fine. You can still ask questions in there. I want to let you know that I go into all of this in a lot more depth in a video training that's on my website. So if you go to jesssherman.com and you click the free video tab at the very top, you'll get to my Food Matters webinar or video training. And that goes into a lot. It's about an hour long, and it goes into a lot of this in more detail. So that's a place. You can also get to that by going to foodforgrowthandlearning.com. That'll take you right to the registration page for that as well. So you can see that. I also have my book, which is called Raising Resilience, which you can learn about at raisingresilience.ca. That's another resource for you, which gives you really practical tips on what to do and how to use food in a way that will promote self-regulation and health in your kids. And then, of course, my Facebook page here. So I'll be doing more live streams here. And please share this because I want to reach anybody who's working with kids. Last time we had a bunch of educators on. We had some parents on, some nutritionists. I want everybody who works at all with kids or interacts with kids in any way to have this information. So parents, social workers, teachers, therapists, guidance counselors, doctors, please share this with them so that they can understand how to use food in the puzzle. Okay, so gluten and dairy. Now, particularly, we're going to talk about gluten and dairy as it pertains to learning and behavior. And what I want to, if you're trying this, if you've tried going gluten-free, or you tried going dairy-free, or you're doing it now, type in the comments and let me know, let us all know what you've done, what you've seen. If you've seen nothing, please tell us you've seen nothing, because it's not uncommon. If you've seen major changes, please let us know that as well. What you've tried, what you've seen with gluten or dairy, and also the questions that you have. Maybe this is something that you're contemplating, but you're not quite sure. And if you have questions about that, go in there. Even if you're on the replay here, I will be moderating those for days to come. So I'm also going to tell you about my Jumpstart program, which is open now. You'll see that on my Facebook page, or on my website as well. And that is sort of the course I created alongside my book, to really help parents who are kind of like, oh, this is too much, this is too complicated, I want to simplify it all down. So a lot of what I'm going to do in this session here is coming straight from that program, my Raising Resilience Jumpstart program, because I talk a lot about gluten in there as well. So some of this is from there. Okay, so gluten and dairy. I feel like this is a very valid place to start when you're trying to get to the root of behavior issues in your kids. And I came to that conclusion by, first of all, hearing about it and hearing lots of success stories. Not consistent, like sometimes they're like, maybe, I don't know. But hearing success stories. So I went to the research to say, like, is there anything to this? Sure enough, there is some research, and then I brought it into clinical practice and have seen pretty amazing results. It's not usually the end of the story, taking out gluten and dairy, but it's usually part of the picture. And what I'm going to walk you through is some of the research, some of what the research can tell us about how these foods are, particularly how the proteins in wheat and, so let me back up just a second. Gluten and dairy are both, it's the proteins. Gluten is a protein, and the protein in dairy that we're talking about is casein. So sometimes you will hear gluten-free, casein-free diet. Sometimes you will hear gluten and dairy, which is, they're two different things really. And sometimes you'll hear wheat-free. What I am talking about in particular are the two proteins, gluten and casein. How they work in the body, I'm going to show you some of the research about that. And like I was saying, show you a little bit about what that research can tell us about how these proteins are affecting the body and how that might affect the brain and behavior. So when I was pulling this together, I kind of boiled it down into 5 reasons why taking out gluten and taking out dairy might help. We don't really know for sure, 100%, and this is one of the pitfalls. One of the things I talked about in the last session was this idea of inconclusive evidence. There's no conclusive, studies to show that this is going to work 100% of the time. And that is true. There are no 100% conclusive studies. But knowing what we know about how these compounds, how these proteins can affect the brain, it brings us a viable starting point. And I kind of looked through and have boiled down 5 possible reasons why this could help. And then 4 things you should know about, 4 pitfalls. Reasons that I see commonly why people don't see results when they take these out. And like I say, you're not going to see results 100% of the time. But a lot of people who say they're not getting results, they're not getting results because they're not doing this properly. They're not doing it deeply enough, and so they're getting conflicting results. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, I'm going to try a little experiment because I have a little PowerPoint presentation on my computer and wasn't able to screen share. So I'm going to flip the phone around and I'm going to show you that just in order to keep myself on track. Like I say, this is taken from the Jumpstart Training Program, which is my program for parents to go along with my book. I'm going to flip this around. Let me see if this works. And I should still be able to see your comments. There, you can see that. Gluten-free, casein-free. So that's my computer. So I'm just showing you my computer, and I should still be able to see the comments. So if you have questions, yes, I can. Please continue to ask them, and I will still be able to answer them in real time. I hope you can see that. If you can't see that, I'll just record it. Oh, it's going to be hard to see, isn't it? Maybe I won't do this. Okay, I'm gonna try. Can you see that? If you're watching, can you tell me if you see that or if it's just annoying? Can we see this presentation again? Yeah, this is going to be on my news feed. So you'll be able to go to Jess Sherman RHN in my Facebook page, and it's going to be up there. Okay, this is going to be annoying, so I'm not going to do that. I am going to just talk it through. Probably better to just see me. Okay, so I'm going to talk it through. So gluten and casein-free diet became kind of the autism diet, quote unquote, back in the 90s when they started looking at seeing that kids with autism had elevated IgA antigens specific to gluten and to casein. And they noticed after 8 weeks of taking kids off of gluten and casein that autistic-like behaviors were improved. So that kind of started this movement, if you would, of autism families saying, oh, well, this is the autism diet. It's not the autism diet. It's it's kind of like a runaway train a little bit. There's much more to food and feeding than just gluten and casein. But nonetheless, you will hear about it out there. It was revisited in 2004, again in 2010, again in 2012. So this idea has been revisited in the literature over and over several times, looking at what happens to autistic kids when you take gluten and casein out. Now again, it never affects 100% of the kids 100% of the time, and it seems to affect kids, in different ways. So there's no real cause and effect line that can be drawn, like if you take gluten out, you will see this. But there does seem to be a generalized conclusion that it improves the health of the kids. And as I go through some of the research and some of that information about what this is what's happening in the body and why this is helping, you'll understand more why there's such a variety in outcomes. So it's also been looked at a little bit for ADHD. 2006 was an earlier study on 132 people with celiac disease, and they screened them for ADHD and they put them on a gluten-free diet, and they noticed a change in their ADHD symptoms when they took gluten out. So these were confirmed celiac patients, but they noticed this correlation between high incidence of people with ADHD who had celiac and of celiac who had ADHD. Another one in 2011 as well. They're fairly small studies, 132 people in one of them, only 67 in another. So they're fairly small, again, not 100% conclusive. In the second study in 2011, only 10 out of the 67 people this looked at the people with ADHD and screening them for celiac disease to see if there was a correlation. Only 10 out of the 67 of the ADHD people had celiac disease, so not even half. But still, I always say to parents, well, what if it's your kid? What if you've been diagnosed with ADHD, but it's just misdiagnosed and it's actually celiac disease? It's worth looking into. In 2011, which so not too long ago, that's when we first the experts got together and first officially acknowledged that there's such a thing as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So we're talking like 6 years ago. It's not that long, and this is one of the reasons why non-celiac gluten sensitivity is not understood by many people, and still not so much. Well, it's becoming more and more adopted, but it takes time for these things to trickle into our collective consciousness. And it was only 2011 that it was officially recognized. So at that time also it was recognized that you can have celiac disease with no gastrointestinal symptoms. And this was another huge change, because originally celiac disease was purely a gastrointestinal issue. But now they started seeing, well, actually, no, you can have celiac disease and have only neurological symptoms or joint symptoms or skin symptoms, pain symptoms, and have a perfectly fine functioning digestive system, no IBS or IBD or chronic diarrhea or blood in the stool, stuff like that. So that was huge as well, also very recent. So now what we're seeing in terms of behavior in kids is that exploring celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity is a really valid place to start, because what's coming out in the literature is an understanding that you can have a reaction to gluten, whether it's driven by antibodies and an immune system reaction like in celiac disease, or it's not involving the immune system like in non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and it can be affecting the brain. So that's really important information. When you look at the studies on gluten, you can see that gluten sensitivity, whether it's celiac or not, is overrepresented in conditions that affect hormones, that affect the immune system, that affect digestion, that affect the brain. Things like Graves' disease and autism and ADHD, cerebellar ataxia, rheumatoid issues, rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, schizophrenia, depression, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis. So they're looking at populations with these conditions and finding an overrepresentation of people who have gluten sensitivity. So there's something going on there, right? If you're interested in this and you really want the studies, I have them in my PowerPoint, but I'm not showing that. You can go to greenmedinfo.com, and they have cataloged a database, and you just enter gluten in their search engine, and you will see all the abstracts. You can't get to I don't think you can get to the actual studies, but you can see all the abstracts, so you can see what's been looked at. So it's very much grounded in research. The question that I always want to ask is, well, why is it? What is gluten doing? Why is it affecting all of these body systems and all of these symptoms? So that's what we're going to look at. I really want you to have this information. I want you to understand what might be happening to influence all of those things that I just mentioned. The research on dairy is not as conclusive. There is some research on elevated IgA antibodies to casein in Rett syndrome, which is a neurological symptom. It has been labeled, alpha-1 casein has been labeled as the top allergen. It's had that dubious recognition for several years now, in that it has a very high potential for stimulating the immune system. It's also been implicated in the development of type 1 diabetes, connected to multiple sclerosis. Not as conclusive in terms of what we're talking about here, which is the brain and behavior, but it does seem to have that potential for irritating the hormones and irritating the nervous system, like in MS and Rett syndrome and such. The reason, though, the biggest reason why I tell people to lump gluten and casein together and take them out at the same time is because of the potential for the two to cross-react in the body. The potential for the body to mistake dairy as gluten. So there is like what I just went through was that there is a lot more study and information showing that it's worth taking out gluten. Less study on dairy, but quite a bit of study showing that the body can mistake dairy for gluten. So that means that if you've taken out gluten and you're still eating dairy, the body might look to the dairy and see it as gluten. So it thinks you're still eating gluten. So this is a complex thing, but it's one of the reasons, one of those pitfalls that I mentioned I wanted to talk about, why sometimes people go on a gluten-free diet and don't see results. One of the reasons is because of this cross-reaction situation. And I want to show you, I am going to flip my phone around just for a second because I stole a little, borrowed a little chart which really nicely shows this. Now I found this on the Paleo Mom website. I don't know if you can see. So if you go to Paleo Mom, she has a really nice explanation of cross-reactivity. And if you go to the paleomom.com and just search for gluten cross-reactivity, I bet you'll find it. She really explains it nicely, and she's got this little chart here, which I screenshot for you. And what this shows us is the potential cross-reactivity of different foods to gliadin, which is the protein, the type of gluten that is most commonly reacted to. So that big, huge bar on the left there, that's gliadin. So that's the reaction to gliadin. And all of these other ones, all these other pink ones, are other reactions to other foods that are stimulated. So you can see these ones here, these are all dairy proteins. Of note here that would be of interest to you would be millet, corn, rice, and to a lesser extent potato. But corn and rice are biggies because what happens when you take gluten out of the diet? You eat all these gluten-free products and they all contain a lot of rice and corn, which also have the potential to cross-react. So this is another reason you need to do this carefully. But of all of these things, and this is brewer's yeast, instant coffee, and a type of oat. One type of oat. There's two here. One is not, and one is cross-reactive. And these are all dairy. So that's why I lump gluten and dairy together, because of that potential. And then I also tell people when they're going to take out gluten to take out the millet, rice, and corn as well, because they have the potential to cross-react. It doesn't mean they're going to. And I won't get into the whole depth of it now. It doesn't mean they're going to. But what I like to do is just sort of clean the slate first, like just take them all out, and then gradually start to reintroduce and see where it gets you. So, really interesting, eh? Did you guys know that? About that cross-reaction? Anyone experimented with this? Now we have a few more people who have popped on. I'm curious to know, first of all, who you are, whether you're a parent or a teacher or a social worker or a nutritionist or a doctor or what have you. I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious to know if you've experimented with a gluten-free diet or a gluten-free, casein-free diet, and if you've seen any changes in you or in your kids. Particularly, we're interested here in talking about how it's affecting the brain. But, you know, some people have all kinds of changes. Thumbs up, yay! Facebook, you're so funny. Okay, so I just also wanted to just back up because we have a few new people on here. The information that I'm giving you here is coming, almost all of it is coming right from my Jumpstart training program, which is up on my website. You can see it there at jesssherman.com. At the top, you can find out information. That's my training program for parents who are really interested in exploring systematically dietary irritants as they pertain to their kids and their kids' behavior and learning. And we are talking particularly today about gluten and casein. Last week, I did one on more broad, like just the four reasons why food matters to behavior, and some of the pitfalls and some of the reasons why some people will tell you not to bother. Oh, hi Julia, thank you. Mother of 2, 3, and 3 months. 3 kids, me too. It's crazy, isn't it? I've got 3 kids as well. Blah, crazy. Oh no, sorry, you're mother of 2. Got it. Sorry. 2 is crazy too. Have done gluten and dairy free for the past few years, mostly to clear eczema and psoriasis. And did it help, Julia? I wonder if it helped your eczema and psoriasis. Is that for your kids or for you? And Naso, I'm a parent. I've seen changes, but I rely on rice a lot for my son. I need to meet up with me. Yeah, oh yeah, hi. Yeah, for sure. Let's talk about that. Yeah, it's a really, really common thing. You go off gluten and you have tons of rice, and then you get constipated and you get flares, and you don't realize that maybe it's the rice. So it's tricky. What I take people through in Jumpstart is you have to make this decision between whether you're going to go gluten-free or you're going to go totally grain-free. Because interesting to note, yeah, oh Julia, yes, it did help your eczema and psoriasis. Was that for your kids or for you, Julia? It's interesting to note that all grains actually contain a type of gluten, right? We think of, when we say gluten-free grains, it's not actually very accurate. Because there are lots of different types of gluten, and they all have the potential to be to do the same thing that we're going to talk about here in a moment. But we only usually test for one type, which is called gliadin. So to be truly gluten-free, you really have to go grain-free, and that's a whole another ballgame. So we can talk about that if any of you need to, about how to make the decision between going gluten-free and grain-free. Sarah, mother to 2 daughters, 2.5 and 5.5. A birth and postpartum doula, awesome. Your husband has celiac disease, so we do a lot of gluten-free in our house, but my girls and I do have normal bread. Yeah, really important. Now I can't see who that was who said you're a postpartum doula. Really important for postpartum depression. Really important, because I won't go deeply into this, but when you're pregnant, your immune system gets suppressed, which you'll know, to not kill the fetus. And then when you deliver, your immune system has to then find its bearings again, and often it goes awry, and autoimmune diseases like celiac start to show themselves if there was a predisposition that just hadn't been triggered. Pregnancy and birth can be the trigger. And so in postpartum depression, it's really important to screen for celiac disease. Julia, psoriasis for me, eczema for my 3-year-old. Now clear. Yay. And she can eat anything. Yay. I am now dairy-free to see if it will help my 3-month-old's congestion through breastfeeding. Yeah, can. Yeah, that's awesome. And that's a really good point, what I talk about a lot in my book, which is once you remove the irritants for a time, if you also support with nutrients and support digestion, sometimes those irritants don't become irritants, are no longer irritants, which is fantastic. That's what we want, right? We want as diverse a diet as possible. So common responses that I see when I take people off of dairy and gluten, I see better eye contact, better communication. I see less aggression. I see better sleep, less bedwetting, fewer nightmares. More stable energy, not the peaks and the ups and downs. And same thing with appetite, more stable appetite. What else do I see? Better digestion, less pain and discomfort, better concentration, more receptive to instructions. Though as I was going through my case files, I was trying to pull out like what is common. Again, gluten has the potential to influence every single tissue of the body. And that's why when we look through the research, we see it affecting so many different conditions, because it really can influence everything. So, okay, I want to talk about 5. Did I do 5? Yeah, 5 reasons. I'm going to do this fairly quickly. 5 reasons why gluten, when you take out gluten, and I also want to say, I'm going to sort of mention gluten, but when I say gluten, I really mean gluten and dairy, because, yeah, no problem, Julia. It's going to be up there. It's going to be here. when I take out gluten, I also take out dairy, and I also take out those cross-reactive foods as well, to do a gluten-free trial. So I'm saying gluten, but I'm meaning all of those things. So why is it working? Possibly because when you take out gluten and dairy, you have to eat more whole foods. Especially if you're also taking out rice and corn, because that kind of takes out a lot of the gluten-free products. I have a 2-page handout in Jumpstart which goes through all of the additives that are derived from gluten and casein. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of foods that you might not recognize as gluten and casein containing, but they are. And if you get rid of the processed foods, then you're pretty much getting rid of them. So that's good. But by doing that, you have to include a lot of whole foods and foods that you cook from scratch. So maybe when you take someone off of gluten and casein, you're only improving things not because you're taking the stuff out, but because you're putting in more whole foods and you have more nutrients coming into the body. That's a valid critique of the gluten-free, casein-free diet. Some people will say, well, it's not because of the gluten casein, it's because you're moving to a whole foods diet. Possibly, but after looking at the research, I think it's probably both. It's probably both. You're taking out an irritant and you're filling up your stores. You're feeding your body in a way that will help it self-regulate. So that's the first reason why it might be helping. Second reason why it might be helping is what it does to the gut microflora. And looking at digestion, looking at what's going on in the bacteria in your body, the microbiome, that's one of the things we talked about in the last training as being one of the reasons why food matters, because food can impact your gut bacteria, and your gut bacteria influence your mood and your behavior and how you think and how you function. We talked about that last time, so be sure to go back and watch that. But gluten, it seems, is one of those foods that affects the gut microbiota. So a really interesting study just last year looked at a small study, again, so not 100% conclusive, only looked at 21 people, but it looked at their markers, digestive markers in their stool. And they saw a shift in several. They looked at 6, I'm just looking at the study here, they looked at 6 biomarkers in the stool, and they saw a shift in a few of them. What's really interesting is that they saw a shift in Clostridia. And Clostridia is a bacteria that has the potential to really influence our mood, and often a problem in autism, often a problem in ADHD. And when they took people off of gluten, they saw Clostridia reduce. So that's really interesting. They also saw a change in in the starch metabolism pathways. So in the ways that your body uses sugar. One of the things I talk about in my book a lot is blood sugar and the effect of blood sugar on your brain. And if it's true that when you take gluten out of the diet, your starch metabolism pathways shift, then that would affect your blood sugar and that would affect your behavior. So maybe that is what's going on when you take out gluten. You're changing gut microbes, you're changing metabolism pathways, and that is showing a difference in behavior. That's the second one. The third one of why this diet might help is that it reduces 2 peptides called, oh, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, sure, come on back later and watch the rest. I know people are napping. It is so impossible to find the right time. That's why I love Facebook Live, because you can always watch the replay. Opioid peptides. So there are 2 peptides called gluteomorphine and casomorphine, which come from gluten and casein. These are partially broken down chains of amino acids. Again, I'm not going to go deeply into it, but basically when gluten and casein are not broken down well, which they are notoriously hard to digest, and so they are often not broken down well, they can interact with the opioid receptors in the brain and act like an opioid drug, which are highly addictive. So one particularly interesting piece of research was looking at how gluteomorphine and casomorphine can actually interact with the temporal lobes of the brain, which are involved in speech and auditory integration. And this might be why when you take out gluten, you reduce the gluteomorphine, and sometimes we see kids who are struggling with speech, we see them progress. Maybe that's why. Again, you're never going to know for sure. There aren't really conclusive tests that you can run to see if this is happening. There are a few, but it's going to run you several thousands of dollars. And just taking the stuff out is the most effective way to figure out whether this is going to be effective for you. And again, this one is looking at gluteomorphine and casomorphine. So there's two. There's the one from gluten and from casein that can both be helpful. And if you take out only one of them and the other one is still active, you're still going to end up with the same symptoms that you started with, and you're not going to see progress. So it's important to do the two together. So that was 3. I think that was 3. Number 4 is that gluten and casein are both very, very high in an amino acid called glutamate. And there's nothing wrong with glutamate. It's actually really important for our health. One of the reasons why bone broth is so helpful and so nourishing is because of glutamate. However, some studies looking at kids with autism and ADHD, kids with behavior issues and concerns, development concerns, looking at that glutamate path, the glutamate receptors and the glutamate transporters, and seeing that they're commonly defective. So that means that glutamate coming in is not working in these bodies the same way it might in other people's bodies. And glutamate has a potential to come up to the brain and be very stimulating. And it is, in a normal process, is that it is used to create an amino acid called GABA. And GABA works the other way. It calms us down. And so with somebody whose glutamate receptors and transporters aren't working well, you can get this buildup of glutamate and it never actually transitions into GABA. And so you're in this hyper excited state and you can't calm yourself down. So the ratio of glutamate to GABA is off. When you take out gluten and dairy, because gluten is they're both actually very a strong source of glutamate. When you take those out, you just kind of reduce that load and the ratio comes back and maybe will calm the nervous system a little bit. So that's the 4th reason why this might work. And the last one, oh no, there's 2 more. I guess that was 3. Pardon me. The next one is maybe it's an allergy or an intolerance. We know lots about dairy allergy. I mentioned it's now, it has been for a while, the top allergen. Pardon me, I've got the burps today. And gluten also is overrepresented in terms of its allergy potential. And we know that you can have an allergy to gluten and have neurological effects. So there's quite a bit of study on that. Maybe when you're taking gluten and dairy out, you found an allergen and you're taking it out, and so the immune system calms down, inflammation calms down, and behavior changes. So that's another one. And the last one I wanted to talk about, the last reason why taking out gluten and casein might be working, might help, is that it can just generally reduce inflammation and reduce intestinal permeability. I'm going to write a whole blog post on that, so I'm not going to get into the technical pieces of it right here, right now. But what we do know, again, quite recently, I think it was maybe 2014 this started to come out, is that gluten in particular, because of the peptides in it, has the potential to trigger intestinal permeability. So that is, well, I'll go into it a little bit. If you can think of all of the cells in your intestinal lining, and there's little spaces, tight junctions they're called, between your cells, and they naturally open and close, regulated by a protein called zonulin, and gluten has a potential to really prop them open by triggering the overproduction of zonulin. So that, and then when they're propped open like that, that's called intestinal permeability. And things that shouldn't get through your intestinal lining can get through. So and then just inside the intestinal lining, inside the body, sits an army of immune cells. And so those immune cells get hyperstimulated and can cause inflammation and a reaction. So gluten seems to have a very, very high potential for causing this propping open, this intestinal permeability, and inflammation. So maybe when you take it out, all you're doing is just generally putting out the flames. It's probably happening. And it probably happens for all of us. Not even, it's probably stimulating that a little bit in all of us, even if we don't see symptoms. One of the things I talked about in my last live stream was that you can think of a child who is struggling to self-regulate, a child with autism or attention problems or behavior problems or throwing tantrums and can't transition or can't sleep. They can't self-regulate, right? They can't calm themselves down. They can't move from one place to another well, and we have to help them self-regulate. And in those kids, I think of them as being like a full glass of water. Like they're just full. They're full of irritation, and the littlest stress, the littlest pressure tips the balance and causes some kind of symptom. And we need to lower that. We need to lower the irritation. And gluten, and possibly dairy, is, it seems, causing increased irritation and inflammation in all of us. But some of us have an emptier glass, and so we don't feel it. It doesn't trigger a symptom because we have a little bit of wiggle room. And somebody commented on this, after taking an irritant out and improving nutrition. Presumably she was also improving nutrition. She was able to reintroduce the irritant, and it wasn't an irritant anymore. And so that's because the irritation had come down. She bought herself a little bit of wiggle room. It's probably still causing a little bit of irritation in there, but it's not creating a symptom. So anyway, that was what I wanted to say about gluten, is that it has the potential for to trigger generalized inflammation and increase intestinal permeability. And really recently, 2014, 2015, we started to see increasing evidence that when you have inflammation in the gut, that translates into inflammation in the brain. And when you have inflammation in the brain, that translates into depression, anxiety, autism, ADHD, all kinds of neurological symptoms. So the way to reduce the inflammation here is to reduce the inflammation in the gut. And since gluten has this potential to increase inflammation and intestinal permeability, taking it out can really just calm the fires. So that was a ton of information, and I hope I didn't get too deep into it. But I do find it's really important for people to understand why they're going to all this trouble to make a diet modification, because I will acknowledge it's not easy, especially if your kids are picky. You guys have picky eaters. If your kids will only eat macaroni and cheese, well then, it's going to be tricky. And I talked last time about that idea of nutritional deficiency and like what happens restricting a child's diet. I talked about that, so go back to the other one and take a look. Michelle, you're on month 3 of dairy and gluten free with your 3-year-old who developed something. What did she develop? He developed. Let me know more about your 3-year-old. Okay, so just to recap what I was just talking about, why might gluten and casein be a factor? Why might it be a viable place to start in terms of, oh, you're welcome. Hey, Carrie. Why might it be a viable place to start when you're trying to influence your child's behavior, whether it's tantrums or sleep or anxiety or depression or autism or ADHD or what have you? You're giving them more foods if you're doing this in a healthy, good way, appropriate way. You're changing their microflora. You're reducing excitatory peptides, gluteomorphine and casomorphine. You're reducing glutamate, and so you're improving the glutamate-GABA balance. You're reducing inflammation and intestinal permeability. So some really strong, this is all coming right from the research, some really strong reasons why this is a good starting place. Some of the pitfalls, some of the reasons why you might not see results. Not considering the cross-reactivity. So that chart that I showed you of, maybe you're taking out gluten, but you haven't taken out rice, corn, and millet and dairy. So your body still thinks you're eating gluten. That's a big one. Maybe you're inducing nutritional deficiencies because you haven't considered what you're going to replace gluten with. So we talked about that last time too as well, is that when you take anything out of the diet, you have to consider what you're going to bring back in. So when you take gluten or grains out of the diet, you need to consider fiber, you need to consider B vitamins, you need to consider folate, you need to consider dairy, calcium if you're taking out dairy. So I think of these not so much as an elimination diet, but as a substitution diet. What are you going to bring back in order to make sure you don't stimulate or induce nutritional deficiencies? So maybe you've taken out the irritant, but you've also taken out nutrition, and so the body is like, it's not reacting to those things anymore, but it also doesn't have the building blocks to heal and to learn like we need it to. Another pitfall, not addressing underlying factors. These kinds of diets are never meant to be long-term. They're meant to be short duration to find the irritant, remove the burden, and then support the underlying issue, which is usually digestion or immune stimulation. Unless you've done testings to show that there's actually like a genetic predisposition or an actual diagnosis or something to remove these for the rest of your life, they're not meant to be removed for the rest of life. We want to buy some wiggle room. We want to reduce the irritants that are in the glass and buy you some wiggle room so that you can reintroduce. So that was another pitfall. And the last pitfall is that if this is more stressful than helpful, it's not helping anybody. So I always say that to people. You have to move only as quickly as you can in order to ensure that your dietary change is more helpful than stressful. If it's too stressful on you, if it's too stressful on your kid, it's not going to help because stress has its own issues, its own influence on the body, right? So it has to be more helpful than stressful. Oh, Michelle, month 3 of trying a gluten and dairy-free diet as a clearing for our 3-year-old who developed a couple of small eczema patches last fall. Things have been stable for her since the dietary shift. I'm considering, can I see more? Yes. I'm considering a mindful return to plain full-fat yogurt or kefir, also returning to baking with organic spelt. Yeah, I would say, how many? Month 3. Yeah, so 3 months is usually okay. I usually tell people do it for at least 6 weeks, and longer if you can. Best case is do it until things clear up, and if they don't clear up, add on to it. With something like eczema, we would add on the dairy, but you've already done that, so that's great. Yeah, and so consider adding it back in. Do a little bit of digestive support first, I would say, maybe some enzymes, some probiotics. Make sure that the restricted diet is also very, very nutrient dense, particularly those nutrients that are important for the skin, like the omegas, and important for the digestion, like zinc and vitamin A and beta carotene and those fatty acids as well. So as long as you've done that, then yeah, give it a try. I would say plain full-fat yogurt or kefir would be a good place. So always starting, what Michelle is picking up on here is that when you're reintroducing a dairy, in this case dairy, start with a fermented dairy because it's much easier to digest, and it's also giving you the probiotic bacteria. You might even want to back it up a little bit, Michelle, and start with ghee, the clarified butter, and then progress to full butter, which is the fat, but most of the casein's been taken out, so it's still mostly fat, not protein. And then go to yogurt. Maybe even start with a non-dairy yogurt, like a different animal, not cow, and then go to cow. So it's kind of working your way up. And baking with organic spelt, yeah. I usually say to start with a sourdough because that's been fermented as well, or sprouted. But if you can find like a sourdough spelt bread, that would be a good way to trial gluten. Again, keep in mind, like, all grain has a type of gluten, so you don't really know what the trigger was. Gluten is kind of a catch-all phrase. Spelt has a particular type of gluten in it that seems to be a little bit more tolerated. So does kamut also. And then when you ferment them and sourdough them, they're even more well tolerated. So yeah, awesome. So I take it that it cleared up. Did the eczema patches clear up? I take it they did. So let me just check my time. Oh gosh, I can talk. I hope that was helpful for you guys. My aim here, my aim with all of this stuff, I really want parents and teachers and doctors and anybody who works with kids to understand the value of working with food, particularly, well, when it comes to everything. But what I have a bee in my bonnet about particularly is a child's ability to focus and learn. And it's a package, right? Like there are lots of things that are affecting our kids' ability to focus and learn. But I was a teacher for many years, and that's where my interest in this came from, is noticing that some kids just didn't have this ability to self-regulate. And their stress was like, they were like this all the time. And yeah, there's lots of factors that influence that, but food is one that is missed. It's so often missed, and it breaks my heart when it's missed because it's such an important factor. And it sounds like some of you have noticed that as well. In my book, I talk about a two-pronged approach to using food because you gotta simplify this. I talk mostly to parents who are overwhelmed, just like myself. I've got 3 kids as well. And it's overwhelming to feed your kids, let alone feed them strategically. And so I simplify it all. I talk about a two-pronged approach, which is to reduce irritation and feed in a way that promotes self-regulation. And they're both important. And I go through some of the irritants, some of the most common irritants. Today we talked about gluten and casein, which are 2 very common irritants, but there are others. And then with feeding in a way that promotes self-regulation, I talk about 3 core diet strategies to focus your attention on, because they have such a trickle-down effect on the body. So that's my approach, and it seems to be working. I get some really good results with my clients, and I created Jumpstart to help more parents who want to just like focus on this, because it can be overwhelming. And Jumpstart really focuses on part 1. It focuses on finding the irritation, and any food influences every tissue in your body, right? Go back to the last one, and I talked about the reasons why food matters so much. It influences everything, and both on a physical level, but also all of the chemical processes in our body rely on food and nutrients. And so having said that, any food can also be potentially an irritant, which is crazy. So we go through the top ones in Jumpstart. We go through gluten and dairy and sugar. We go through additives. We go through food, some of the common food chemicals that, like phenols and oxalates and glutamate, things like that are very commonly irritating. Nothing inherently wrong with them. We talked about glutamate today, but they can irritate the body, and they can affect the nervous system, and they can affect behavior. So we can trial those. We talk about environmental chemicals as well, because that's really important. And I take you through a process of being really systematic about taking these out and then reintroducing them strategically, so that you don't undo all of the work you went through. And I'd also talk about what to expect, because often when you take the stuff out, gluten and casein in particular, things get worse before they get better. And that's because they're very addictive, and the body goes through a withdrawal process, and things have to rejig. Blood sugar changes, the nervous system changes. There's a lot of digestion shifts. So things can get worse before they get better. And so you really need to know what you're looking for and what to expect. So we go through all that. So that's all I have for today. My website, jesssherman.com. And you can see all the links there. You can see the links to the Food Matters video training, which is more in depth of why food matters. You can also see a link at the top right to the Jumpstart program. That registration is open now, along with some bonuses and things. And I'm probably going to do another live stream. I know some of you are on March break and have naps and things. It's impossible to find the right time. So I'll do another one. If you have particular topics that you want me to address, put them in the chat and I will do my best to address them. I really love doing live stream. I love interacting with people. So the more questions, the better. Continue to ask questions, even if you're watching a replay, because I will monitor them. Okay, take care. Bye for now.